All right, welcome everybody to our top 10 myths about special education that we are going to bust today. If you are watching this recording on YouTube or if you are listening on the podcast, please drop a comment and just let us know that you've listened and what questions you have. And if you are left at the end of this with any more questions, especially more specialized questions, particularly for your child, please be sure to use the link in the show notes and in the caption if you're watching on YouTube to schedule your complimentary 20-minute consult with us. So we are going to get right into this. I am Michelle and I am joined by...
Hi everyone, this is Dana Murray, the other half of Empowered to Advocate. And our goal today is just to help you so that you are able to recognize these myths when you hear them and to be able to feel confident to advocate for your child with all of the accurate and correct information. So like Michelle said, we'll go through these pretty quickly. We do have 10 to cover today, but if you have specific questions about your child or a little bit more in-depth information about one of these myths, please reach out to us. We always love to hear from you.
Yay, so we're going to dig right in, and this first myth is if a child is found not eligible for special education, they will never be eligible to receive support through an IEP. And in fact, in order to be eligible for an IEP, we think about a student having a determined disability, not making progress in school. That lack of progress is due to the disability. And then the student also is going to require specialized instruction and/or services in order to make progress. If any of these factors were not true at one time, at the time of an eligibility meeting, but are true now, a parent or caregiver has the right to request an updated evaluation. Okay. And this is also true for if you are an educator or somebody working in a school. Know that if you had if you have a child in your classroom now who was not eligible for special education a few years ago or even last year, and you continue to have concerns, make sure you're connecting with the person at your school in charge of evaluations.
And our number 2 myth is actually not that dissimilar. It's kind of in the same vein. Our second myth is a medical diagnosis by a doctor automatically means a child is eligible for an IEP, and that's just not true either. Like Michelle said, there are many factors that go into determining whether or not a student is eligible for an IEP. Do they have a disability? Do they require specialized instruction or services to make progress? A medical diagnosis does not automatically mean it will impact a student's learning. I think the one takeaway for the second myth, though, is that if you are a parent or caregiver and you've gone with your child maybe to the pediatrician's office and the doctor has determined that they have a new diagnosis or an updated diagnosis, that is absolutely information you can be sharing with the school team, with the teacher, with an administrator, with somebody in special education in your school or district. If you share that information, that's the best way to determine if moving towards an eligibility meeting is the right next best step.
Great. And coming up third today, a 504 plan is a consolation plan for not getting an IEP. So we oftentimes come to an eligibility meeting and a student may be not eligible for an IEP, but the team might say, well, maybe they are eligible for a 504 plan. And this does not mean that a 504 plan is second best or a runner-up. In fact, this is a very, very important and legally binding document that provides accommodations and protections for students and adults under Section 504 in relation to their disability. So if a student does not qualify for an IEP because they don't require specialized instruction or services, they might still require accommodations to access school. This is when a 504 plan will come in. It's still a legally binding document that is required by law to be followed by folks who are providing instruction to your child. And it actually falls under the Office of Civil Rights. in terms of who oversees this. So it is a very important document that is not a runner-up or second best sort of thing.
All right, our next myth is an IEP focuses only on academics and those core academics, reading, writing, and math. We do get lots of questions from parents and caregivers whose children, whose students have difficulty in these areas, reading, writing, and math. But the truth of it is there are many different reasons that a child might require specialized instruction. There are many different disability categories that might require that a child or a student requires an IEP and special education. There are many pieces to an IEP as well. In addition to the specialized instruction, there are also related services, accommodation, sometimes modification. There are lots and lots of different parts of an IEP. And I think that sometimes folks think that it's just reading, writing, and math, right? If their child needs extra help in those areas. But an IEP is so much more comprehensive than that, and special education is so much more comprehensive. Some examples related to a student's disability, they might need not just academic support, but they might need social support or social emotional support. They might need behavioral support to access the grade level curriculum. They might need occupational therapy, fine motor and sensory instruction, gross motor, physical therapy instruction. They might need communication instruction. They may require a communication device or other accommodations so that they can access the grade level curriculum. Those things can be related, obviously, to the core academic subjects and areas, but they don't necessarily have to be either. And so that's something to keep in mind when we're thinking about who might qualify for an IEP in special education and what a robust IEP might actually look like.
Coming up next, this is one that we encounter fairly often, and it's the myth that a student who attends a private school is not eligible for special education or an IEP. So in fact, the school district that the student lives in is responsible for evaluations and providing needed services via an IEP if a student in private school requires services. If you think your child has a disability for which they need an IEP and they attend a private school, you should go ahead and request an evaluation through the Director of Pupil Services in your district. And if you're not sure how to find out that information, speak with the teachers and administrators at the school that your child attends so that they can help guide you on this process.
And I should also add before we move to the next myth, because this actually just came up recently in a conversation, this applies for students who attend charter schools as well. We focus our myth on private schools, but this also applies to students who attend charter schools, and it's a little bit different. So once again, this applies to you. Make sure that you speak to the administrator or the teacher at the school where your child does attend. Okay, moving on to our next myth. An IEP is for any student who needs extra help. And that is just simply not true. There are many, many, many reasons why a child might need extra help in school. They could have a chronic illness. They could have been absent a lot. They could have moved schools, or they've maybe moved schools frequently. They could have gaps in learning because of any of those factors. They could be learning English as a second language or a third language or a fourth language, and that might impact their ability to access the grade level curriculum. So there are many reasons why a child might need extra help in school, and it's not always necessarily related to a disability. Now, of course, schools and school districts are required to be providing interventions, tiered interventions to students who need extra help, whether or not they are on an IEP. It's going to look different for students who are not in special education, obviously, but they are still required to be providing that support in their classroom and in their school. So if you're thinking to yourself, I don't know if my child has a disability, but I do think that they struggle in these areas, it might be worth a conversation with a teacher or an administrator and say, you know, I'm not sure that they qualify for special education, but I noticed this specific struggle. What does the school have that they can offer to support my child as they navigate whatever the reason might be.
Next myth is if you have an IEP, you must be placed in a separate classroom. And I think that this myth very much relates to even when we were in school and generations before us, where students with disabilities were often placed in classrooms that were very separate from the regular education classrooms, from their grade level peers, and you didn't necessarily see them very often out and about in the school. And the truth is that the goal is always to have a student receive their services, receive their instruction in the least restrictive environment. Least restrictive environment would be that classroom where all the other fourth graders or all the other eighth graders are receiving their learning. And there is a whole spectrum that districts and schools will try to work through to try to ensure that a student is receiving as much access to that inclusion as possible. Sometimes students do need a very specialized kind of program. This might happen within the regular school, like the neighborhood school, but in a separate classroom. It might happen at what we call an out of district, like a collaborative school. And the goal is always to have students in the neighborhood school, in the regular education classroom as much as possible. Try things and interventions in that space, and then move across the spectrum as a student might need additional supports.
This is a big one. The next myth is that special education is always a battle. We hear from parents and caregivers who perhaps have had difficult situations in schools or with folks in the district. We hear from people who have had challenging IEP meetings, challenging eligibility and IEP processes, and they feel really defeated, and they feel like it's always going to be a battle and they're always going to have to fight, and they're always kind of ready for that. And, you know, just like any other team, any other collaborative process, there are going to be differences in opinions and philosophies when it comes to what's going on and what's happening at an IEP team meeting. It can be super frustrating. It can leave a bad and a sour taste in your mouth. But the best thing that you can do is just be prepared. We continually tell parents and caregivers, you can't obviously change or impact how maybe everybody else at the table acts, how every other team member comes to those meetings. But the best thing that you can do for yourself and for your child is to come prepared to that meeting, equipped with your toolbox of everything that you need to advocate for your kid, while also being open to hearing from the other members of the team. We do believe that most people, the majority of people, come to those meetings wanting what is best for the child and wanting what is best for your child. And it can still be really, really difficult. So ask for help, ask for support, reach out if you need help and support navigating the process, and don't be afraid to ask questions so that you can be as prepared going into those situations and meetings as possible.
I think it's also important to note here, Dana Marie, that the horror stories or the scary stories are often the ones that get pushed out much faster in all facets of life, right? And so when, especially if you are new to this process, you might speak with somebody who has had a bad experience. Just try to remember that you are going in here with the best intentions for the support for your child, and go into the meeting assuming that everybody else at that table also has those good intentions for your child and wants to support your child. The more you know, the more you can ask, the better prepared you are.
Michelle, that's such a good point, because that's the reason we're doing this in the first place, trying to dispel these myths, is because we always hear misinformation. We always hear myths from parents or caregivers, and it's nobody's fault, but there's so much information circulating around special education, whether you're reading articles or maybe you're even digging into case law. Who knows how you're getting information? But that's kind of how we got here in the first place, wanting to have this be our next conversation, is because we know that it can be hard, really difficult to take in what you're hearing from other parents, from teachers, from other people in the community, and figure out what's true, what's not true, and what's going to be the most helpful for you as a parent.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. An IEP can only be changed once a year, and that is a myth. And while an IEP must be reviewed at least annually and is legally binding, it's also a living and breathing document that can be revisited and amended between annual reviews, especially if additional accommodations and service amounts, or even if there needs to be a discussion about a different placement, needs to be discussed. So this is especially important if a student is not making progress what is currently in their plan. So if when you get those progress reports, as often as your child gets report cards, you should also be getting progress reports on their IEP goals. If you're noticing that they're not really progressing, or it seems extra slow, and sometimes it's hard to tell like what that means, but don't be afraid to ask to get the team together to discuss any concerns. Once you request this type of meeting, the team should reconvene within 10 school days to hear your concerns and have a conversation and make those adjustments to the IEP via an amendment, or in the case of a placement, through a new IEP, to make sure that the child is continuing to progress.
Which brings us to our next myth. The myth is that parents do not get input in the actual and final development of the document, of the IEP, and that is not true. You are an important and essential part of the IEP team and of the IEP process. No one knows your child better than you do, and your concerns and vision for your child's future, as well as their own vision, should be front and center, should be the main driving points for the IEP development. So we talk about this often. You've definitely heard us say this before. You do not need to sign an IEP at an IEP meeting. You do not need to agree to an IEP at an IEP meeting. The best thing that you can do is take the time that you're able to look over the document once it is sent to you, and make sure that your input was validated. Make sure that you were affirmed through that process, that your child was affirmed through that IEP process, and make sure that your voice is there and their voice is in there, because like we said, you are such a crucial, essential part of this team, and we want to make sure that your voice is heard in the development of the IEP and in that living, breathing document that Michelle was talking about.
So each district has their own timeline for evaluations and IEP development. Again, that is a myth. And sometimes I'm sure districts wish that they had their own timelines to do things. But in fact, while exact timelines can differ from state to state, all districts are adhering to timelines dictated by their state based on the guidelines of federal law. So some timelines that you will want to be aware of are how long a district has to conduct testing when they receive consent. How long does it take for you to receive the proposed IEP? In Massachusetts, some important timelines to know are: if you request an evaluation, the district must respond to you within 5 school days. Once you have returned consent to the district has 30 school days to conduct the testing, 45 school days to come together as a team and review it. And if the student is eligible, or after an annual meeting, they have 10 school days to deliver that IEP to you. So those are Massachusetts guidelines and timelines, and there are differences from state to state, but they're all based on federal law and should be in your parents' notice of procedural safeguards for you to refer to, that you can find online, or you can find by requesting it. You should be given it at least annually. But just in case you don't receive that, you can request it.
And we should also note, Michelle, that we actually do work with parents and caregivers in Massachusetts, but also in other states outside of Massachusetts. So we are familiar with some of the differing laws in other states. If you are confused or you do not know what the law is in your state, please, please, please feel free to reach out to us. Like Michelle said, many of the guidelines and many of the timelines are governed by federal law. And then there are some nuances between states, but we can help to point you in the right direction to the information that you need based on wherever you live. So with that said, in summary, do not be afraid to ask questions. You are an important part of the IEP team. And if you have questions, it is absolutely your right to make sure that those questions are answered as a parent or a caregiver or as an educator. The special education process, eligibility process, and IEP process, like we said, are all governed by specific laws and guidelines. Schools and districts need to follow them no matter the circumstance. If you have questions about what those specific laws and guidelines are and how they might impact your own child, their services, their placement, etc., like we said, please do not hesitate to reach out. And then finally, remember that any of these myths could be their own separate conversation, their own separate webinar, their own separate podcast. There's lots of information here, and we went through it pretty quickly. So please reach out if you do have more in-depth questions about any of the 10 myths that we did cover today.
So if you have questions, please comment. You can email us at empoweredtoadvocate@gmail.com, or go ahead and use the link that's either in the show notes or on our website at empoweredtoadvocate.com, or in the caption if you're watching on YouTube, to schedule that 20-minute complimentary consult with us.
And we do have folks today who are listening on the podcast, wherever you find your podcasts. We also have folks who are watching us on YouTube, and there are countless other ways to connect with us. Our tag, our handle is empowered2, like the number, advocate, and you can find us on LinkedIn, on YouTube, on Instagram, on Facebook, and we hope that you'll also subscribe to our bi-weekly newsletter, and that's where you can get the most up-to-date information coming to your mailbox every 2 weeks.
So just a disclaimer, by participating in our live webinars, listening on the podcast, watching our YouTube videos, you acknowledge that Empowered to Advocate will provide thoughtful, comprehensive, and data-driven coaching and advice. By participating, you understand that this service is not legal advice, nor does it constitute legal services. It's understood that Empowered to Advocate is serving in the role of coach and consultant to you on your child's behalf. In participating, the parent caregiver, that's you, understands that there are no guarantees of success in obtaining this outcome desired by the parent or caregiver. The parent caregiver agrees to hold Empowered to Advocate and any coaches working with them harmless in regard to the outcome of meetings, services, hearings, etc.
And with all of that, thank you so much for listening, for being here for our top 10 myths. Drop us a line if you have any additional questions.
Thanks for being here.
Bye.